Hello, and welcome to the AWS Summit Online. Greetings of the day. I'm appreciative that you have decided to spend this time with us. In the next 35 minutes, what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through how do you create a migration strategy for your portfolio of applications. Okay, my name is Nirav Kothari. I'm a part of AWS Professional Services team. I'm a principal consultant, and I have been doing migrations since 2014. Incidentally, the one that I'm doing right now is migrating 7 countries for a large insurance customer, 3 in South America and 4 in Western Europe. Okay, let's dive quickly into the presentation. What we're going to do today is we're going to cover 3 aspects, 3 parts. The first one is I'm going to, at a very high level, a single slide, do a process overview of how we consider doing migrations. The next thing that I want to talk about is dive deeper into migration strategy, which will include what we refer as 7 R's of migration strategy. We'll explain those R's. We'll talk about how do you quickly identify some of those influencing factors which will help you map your migration strategy to one of those R's. We'll talk about some good best practices, and we'll talk about how do you map migration or application to these migration strategies. All right, so let's dive right in. So this first slide, don't look at graphics. I'm not great with graphics. But on this slide, what we're trying to do is lay out 4 important phases that you'll go through in your migration journey. And the first phase is assessment. When we talk about assessment, we're referring to 2 distinct assessments. The first one is what happens at a portfolio level. You look at your entire data center, or you look at your entire portfolio of a given line of business applications. And then the second part of the assessment that we're referring to is look at an individual application. And so that's what we refer to as assessment. You're gathering, basically in this phase, you're gathering all the information that you require to plan a migration of a given workload. What comes after assessment, what comes after assessment is readiness and planning. Everything you captured in assessment feeds into readiness and planning. What you're doing in the readiness and planning phase is you're individually looking at each one of these applications. You are identifying how will it be migrated. You are ensuring that you're ready for the migration. Your licenses, your architecture, your landing zones are taken care of. And your timelines are agreed upon. Timelines, especially if the system is going to cause an outage, you might have to communicate with your partners, with any other dependent application about the outage. And so from a timeline perspective, you're ensuring that both technically and from timeline perspective, you're ready to migrate. Once you do that, once you've identified your readiness for migration, you will end up doing the actual migration. So that's the third phase. And then the last phase is once an application is migrated, once it's lit up in AWS, you will keep the lights on. You are going to operate, you're going to support, you're going to maintain the application in AWS. Now, what you see at the bottom part of the screen is a checklist or a toll gate review. Imagine you're doing this application migration at a very large scale. When you're running migrations at scale, when you're thinking about factory, the biggest thing that you want to consider is how am I going to get consistency and delivery quality with every migration, with every application migrated. And that's where this checklist-based approach will come into picture. A checklist will consistently ensure that any resource, regardless of whether this is your existing team, whether this is AWS Professional Services, or whether these are partners helping you in your migration journey, each and every resource will consistently deliver against the identified phases. A checklist will also serve as a good enforcement to ensure corporate governance and security are enforced as you migrate applications into AWS. Okay? With that high-level process laid out, let's talk about what happens with assessment and what are those R's migration. Okay. Now, before I start talking about those R migration strategy, I also want to call out the R migration strategy is actually based on 5 R's of migration white paper that Gartner published. And so it's based on a similar concept. A lot of you would have experience doing that. And so it was a notable call out. I wanted to ensure that I do lay it out. So back to assessments. As I said on the previous slide, assessment begins at a portfolio level. There are quite a few bullets that I've listed out over there, such as you want to consider financial assessment, security assessment, compliance requirements, any business or technical specific, technology specific requirements, any contractual requirements. All of this will feed into a portfolio level. You're not looking at an individual application right now. A portfolio level assessment on those high level criteria. Once that's done, there could be some early or very easy dispositions, such as if you are working against a compelling event, contractual obligation, or contractual assessment. If you're working against a compelling event, such as a data center closure, you're running out of lease, you're coming up to a hardware refresh, what have you, end of life, end of support, any one of those compelling events which are time sensitive might push you towards take your entire portfolio and just lift and shift or rehost, right? There could be additional influencing decisions or dispositions that security or compliance at portfolio level might define. And so once you're done through a portfolio level, if there are early dispositions, you'll apply them. Everything else beyond that stage is an application level assessment. You will look at the application, you will categorize them into those 7 R's that I've listed on the slide. We'll get into a lot more details around those R's. But you will map individual applications against one of those R's, which are retain or relocate, rehost, replatform, re-architect, repurchase, refactor, and retire. If you look at the slide, the retain or retire are easy ones. They just, as the name says, you're going to retain, you're going to retire them. Everything in between, whether you are considering refactoring, re-architecting, replatforming, is what I simplify as you're going to redeploy it. The question at that point comes, why is rehosted also summarized as redeploy? Well, with rehosted, you also have an option to not use a tool-assisted forklift. You can do a parallel build and use the migration as an opportunity to do a code-based deployment. That could be your first step in modernizing it. And therefore, it's categorized as redeployment. Okay? So, assessment phase started at a portfolio level, some high-level assessments, contractual, security, compliance, technical, business, so on and so forth. Any early dispositions applied, and then you did assessment at an individual application level to start mapping application to those 7 R's. Now that we've started talking about 7 R's, let's get into a little more details around what those R's are. So to jump into the details, the first thing I want to do is I want to explain or define each one of those R's. So the first R, retain, or you will see relocate in parentheses. What it really means is you're going to continue retaining the application as is. You're not going to do migration. You're not going to touch it. You're going to leave it as is. No changes. Okay? Optionally, you might consider relocate. Imagine that you're working on a data center. Less than 5% of the workloads in that data center are retain workload. And in that case, you might want to shut down that entire data center, take those 5% of retained application, put them in another data center. That way you can get rid of a data center, and then you can still have applications that you were not able to touch running as is. Okay? The next R I want to talk about is rehost. Rehost, people also tend to use terms like lift and shift, forklift. All of them are valid terms. What rehost really means is without changing the application, the functionality, the underlying operating system, the version, you're just bringing the application as is into AWS. Okay? Minimal effort. A lot of customers have done it. A lot of maturity is available across the industry. A lot of ISV partners do have tools, processes, methodology to do rehost. And that's it. That's rehost. The next R is replatform. Imagine you're running an application on an older version of operating system. Or imagine an application vendor recently delivered a new functionality in a newer version, but for you to do it, you'll have to perform an upgrade. Okay? Any one of those would qualify as a replatform migration strategy. Okay? You might, as a part of the strategy, perform a reinstall in the target environment in AWS. You might have to do some data conversion. You might have to do application redeployment, so on and so forth. In any one of the previous R's, retain, you were not touching it. Rehost, you're touching it, but you're not doing any changes. With replatform, there are some changes required. And at minimum, you're going to reinstall the application in the target environment. Okay? Moving on to the next R. The next R is re-architect. Here's your opportunity to look at an existing architecture of an application and modernize it if the business demands so. A good example is you had an application, but the application was developed in the past. It didn't offer modern capabilities such as running on a mobile phone. You want to offer an application on mobile devices to your customers. You want to swap out an older legacy technology for a newer technology. You want to bring in new modern functionality, capability into the application. You will identify re-architecting the application as your migration strategy. Now, what you'll also notice in the parentheses, I'm talking about repurchase. That's really referring to if you want additional capability in your application, and if the application software vendor is offering a hosted solution, a SaaS version, consider that as your opportunity. Okay? So, repurchase or re-architecture is rewriting, rebuilding the entire application on a modern architecture, adding new functionality, new capability, or at minimum, consuming some of the cloud-native functionality that AWS would offer. Okay? Moving on to the next R migration strategy, refactor. This is the most time-consuming, a lot of involvement, because refactor by definition would mean you're going to rewrite your entire application. A classic example is imagine an application that was developed in the past, monolith, millions of lines of code, and because of that, even if you were to do a small new functionality rollout, you have to redeploy the whole million line of code. It's error prone. Something might break. Here is your opportunity. Break it up into microservices. Adapt to a more modern SOA-based architecture. Any one of those which would require you to rewrite an entire application is what we define as refactoring. The last R that I want to talk about is retire. As the name suggests, retire would mean you're going to do nothing. You're not doing anything with the application. You're just going to retire it. At best, you're going to take the data, and depending upon your retention policy, ensure the data is available, but the application is going to sunset. All right? Now that we have defined each one of those R's, let's quickly talk about are there early indicators, are there influencing factors that will quickly help you strategize an application to one of these R's. So here are some of the influencing factors. Now there could be many more. Okay, these are some very generic, easily applied when you look at an application, when you look at an individual application. All right, let's talk about it. For retain or relocate, which means you're not going to do anything, at best you're going to change the physical address of the asset. Imagine you're running an application on an unsupported operating system. The application is giving you a very point spot solution, a very unique functionality that you need, but the application is no more supported. The software vendor is not doing any new development, and therefore you're bound to an older version of operating system. Any one of those reasons are a good influencing early indicator to retain them or change the physical address by relocating this application or workload somewhere else. Rehost, imagine servers running packet software. Imagine application that was developed in the past, which doesn't have enough of good documentation. There's no code available. So any one of those examples, COTS, commercial other self, where you're just running it on a host. Even by doing anything else, you're not going to gain any new functionality, or application which doesn't have enough of documentation, no source codes available, and therefore you can't touch it, even if you want to. Those are good influencing factors for you to consider rehosting an application. There are tool-assisted rehost options available. So you install an agent on the workload. It will synchronize in AWS Cloud. It will allow you to do a dry run if you want to test the target environment. But basically, a click-through migration. Okay, don't touch anything. Don't do anything else. Replatform. Imagine an upgrade required by an application or database vendor to support a new functionality. Right? Imagine that the software vendor has announced an end of life or end of support of an operating system or an application, a commercial off-the-shelf application. Or imagine a business need for new native cloud functionality. Any one of those are good enough factors for you to consider replatform as your migration strategy. Swapping out an operating system, changing a database engine, are good examples of sort. So if you're thinking of doing any one of those for a given workload, replatform is the migration strategy you want to start thinking about. Re-architecture, again, business-driven architectural changes, right? A good example, could be cost or license requirement. You're spending too much on some license, and you want to swap it out for open source. Changing the application components for a newer functionality is where I would consider re-architecting. Or if there is a hosted solution available, I'll just go ahead and repurchase it. Okay. The next thought I want to talk about is refactoring. This is, as I said in the previous slide, this will stretch your technology satisfaction, your technology outcomes. It could be a little time consuming, but it'll get you the most modern, satisfactory architecture that you can think of in a cloud native fashion. So refactoring, imagine changing software component or adding new functionality. Imagine the example I used on previous slide was, here's a monolith with million line of code. You're going to break it up into microservices, use serverless in cloud, right? All of these are great examples of considering refactoring as your migration strategy for that given workload. And then retire. Some classic example of retiring an application. A lot of organizations have grown through mergers and acquisitions. And if you are one of them, you would know with acquisition came some software components, some software applications, workloads that might have an overlapping duplicate functionality with what you already had. If that is really the case, here's your opportunity retain the data that the duplicate functionality application had, and retire one of them, right? Identify an application that could be easily retired, that was delivering, serving far fewer overlapping functionality, and just retire, right? So those are some of the influencing factors that you would consider for retiring an application. Now that we went through assessment at a portfolio application level, we defined what each one of those R migration strategies are. We talked about some influencing factors that you can apply at an individual application level. Let's go back to the first slide. We spoke about the top tier, or the top part of the graphics. The bottom part of the graphics, the checklist, is what we're going to talk next. Tollgate reviews, checklist, name it what. The idea is ensuring that how do you enforce consistent output from a given phase fed into the next phase, regardless of who's working upon it, whether it's a super matured, experienced engineer or whether it's a new hire. And that's where a checklist comes in handy. So a checklist coming out of the first phase, the assessment phase, will ensure that everything that you require to do readiness and planning, which is the next phase, is being done, is being consistently captured. All right? So let's dive deeper into the checklist for the assessment phase. The first thing that I would talk about is a good, solid inventory. In the checklist, ensure that you gather a good, solid inventory, which will not just include hardware components such as CPU, memory, storage requirements, but also software components such as operating system, off-the-shelf, database, version details, so on and so forth. As you would imagine, in the next phase, this information will help in two ways. The hardware information will help you identify EC2 instance, and if you have right-sizing information, CPU memory utilization information, it will help you in right-sizing and cost optimizing. The software operating system version details will help you to ensure that your licenses are portable. When you go to cloud, you can bring on your licenses. You don't have to spend extra. So that's that. Okay, so that's how information collected in assessment phase will feed into the readiness and planning phase. The next thing that you want to do is identify both internal and external dependencies. And within internal, you want to identify upstream and downstream dependencies with this candidate application. What I mean by upstream and downstream is any application that the candidate application depends on, or any application that the candidate application is feeding into. Because when you start planning migration, remember, timeline is one of the aspects of planning. And from a timeline standpoint, all the upstream and downstream dependencies will have to be notified. You'll have to ensure that they are aware that the candidate application is going away. It's going away into cloud. Okay? Same thing with external dependencies. You might have a partner, your vendor, where you might have to go and set up new VPN connections or whitelist IP addresses. At minimum, you'll have to notify them about a downtime if that's what is going to happen when you're migrating this candidate application. So identify all upstream, downstream, internal, external dependencies, because that'll feed into your readiness and planning. The next thing is you want to ensure that all these security requirements are being captured. Baseline what's done today. Also try and explore what could be done better tomorrow in your target state. Capture all of this as your security requirements so that when you go to the next phase of readiness and planning, you can identify solutions to be implemented or technology to be deployed to meet those security requirements. Use assessment as an opportunity when it comes to security to go beyond what is bare minimum requirement. You can stretch. Review migration timelines. Remember, next phase is readiness and planning. Part of planning is timeline. So review timeline from a standpoint of, is there a month-end, quarter-end processing that the application will need to do? Is there an active rollout? Is there a schedule to upgrade? Are there maintenance activities? Any one of these things happening could conflict with the timeline in which the application could be migrated should be identified in the assessment phase. Ensure you have a checklist item so that anybody doing the assessment captures timeline-specific information. The next thing you want to do, the last thing you want to do is make sure you got test plans identified. If these are automated test plans, better. If not, at least make sure there are documented test plans available and people identified to run those test plans or those testing procedure once an application is migrated. Okay? That concludes the assessment phase. Remember, this is a checklist which is very generic. You will add additional organization, enterprise specific aspects into this checklist. The reason to put together that simple checklist was to give you a sample of all of these things are bare minimum requirement to feed into the next phase. So you don't want to go to the next phase and then come back and, oh geez, I forgot about, what happens to licenses. Oh, I don't know how much of IO do I need, so on and so forth. All right? Enforce everything that you need from a governance standpoint, from a security standpoint, anything that you need in the second phase of readiness and planning. Make sure you are capturing an assessment. Make sure checklists are available so that anybody can independently gather all of that information consistently to feed to the next phase. The next phase, which is the readiness and planning phase. Let's talk about a checklist for readiness and planning phase. Now, before we get into the details of readiness and planning phase, the first bullet in there, you will notice these are the things that are not ongoing. It's a one-time activity. What we typically tend to do is, for any given engagement, when we kick off the readiness and planning phase, there's a one-time activity, which is to create 3 important documents. The first one is a decision log. Any decision that you make during the migration phase or during the readiness and planning phase should be captured, should be documented. Because remember, every decision is probably not going to be driven by technology alone. You might make a decision based on timeline. And if a decision is not captured, if it's not well documented, how will you ensure that the future generations of optimization will have enough of context on why a particular decision was made? So, decision log. The next one is risk register. Any risk you identified, whether this is negotiating your license terms with a software vendor, whether this is verifying compatibility of a particular application component, anything that poses a risk in your migration or migration strategy is what you want to capture so that it can get reviewed on a weekly basis. The last one was issue log. Any issue that you're facing, any help, any escalations required, capture them into issue log so that they could be reviewed on a weekly basis. Right? Those are one-time activities. Now, with every individual application, what you want to start doing is you want to review current architecture and start discussing, defining, getting double-clicked into a future state or a desired state architecture. To do so, if it's a business critical complex application, what we recommend is do a whiteboard session. Do a whiteboard session and dive deeper into each component of the target state architecture, such as, am I going to use EC2 or am I going to go serverless? If I'm using EC2, what instance family am I going to use, depending upon whether the application has CPU, memory, or I/O contention. Once you identify that, am I going to use auto-scaling? If so, are my applications ready to do so? Where am I storing state information? Right? What type of storage do I need? What NACLs? What what security groups? Is it going to be a multi-AZ architecture? Is it going to be deployed across 2 AZs? What is my DR or business contingency planning strategy around the application? Capture all of this information, especially if it's business critical. Regardless, all of this information that you did on a whiteboard, you discussed, you reviewed with the application owners, the developers, the business team, everything that you decide goes into the decision log. More importantly, all the decision that you make in this architecture review gets captured into what we refer as a design document. Think about design document is what will get fed to the next phase, which is the migration phase. Imagine, let me switch to the next slide. Imagine that redeploy is one of your migration strategy. You are going to need CloudFormation or equivalent infrastructure as a code deployment method. So create this design document, capture all of this information, EC2 and IO and security group, and here's a NACL and here's a DR, and this is how frequently I'm going to back it up into your design document, feed it to the migration team who will then end up creating a CloudFormation out of this, right? Anything that you will require to build out the CloudFormation is what you want to include in this checklist, all right? That's how you want to think about it. So that was about readiness and planning checklist. Again, as I said in the previous slides, this is not everything about the checklist. There will be additional things specific to your environment, specific to in your context that you will add to your checklist. But make it a checklist-driven approach that will allow you to scale in a consistent and predictable manner. All right. The next 5 slides are best practices. I'm not going to go into details of these slides. They will be available for your read-through when we share these slides. The only message that I want to leave behind with these slides is the best practices slides for each one of those are strategy, are based on collective experience of AWS professional services doing migrations in many, many, many customer accounts, as well as our partners. All right. So there are some good best practice recommendations in there. This one is for best practices for rehost. The next slide is best practices for replatform. The third one is for re-architecture, repurchase. And then there's best practices for refactor. Moving on, you'll realize I don't have a slide for best practices for retire. Because as the name suggests, you're going to retire. There's no recommendation, right? Though there are a couple of words of wisdom. First and foremost, ensure that any data that the application has, depending upon your data retention policy, you preserve the data so that you're not falling out of compliance. And then retire doesn't mean stop using the application. Retire to me means I'm going to sunset, I'm going to shut it down, I'm going to remove it from my inventory. All right? So that's what are 2 words of wisdom for retire. Now that brings me to my last slide. On this slide, again, I'm not going to go into the details of the slide, but I want to lay out on this slide. The only message that I want you to take back on this slide is everything that I shared with you so far. You don't have to stress out thinking that, oh, geez, I have to do all of this on my own. There's a lot of help available. There's a lot of maturity in the industry around migrating to cloud. Both from an ISV standpoint, a lot of tools available, but also from a system integrators standpoint. So a lot of our ISV partners and SI partners have a lot of maturity and experience in assisting our customers do migrations. So you don't have to do all of this on your own. Your AWS professional services team, partners, ISV vendors, tools, a lot of help available. Feel free to reach out to your account team or to AWS professional services or to your partners should you need any help doing these migrations. What you see on this slide, though, is broken up by each one of those phases that we have been consistently talking about in this presentation. There are native tools that AWS offer at no additional cost to you. You're welcome to use any one of these tools or tools of your choice. But here are some of the tools that we make available to you guys in your journey to cloud, in your journey to AWS. That's it. That is all that I had to share with you guys. Thank you so much for your time. And here are my coordinates on that slide. My email address there. If you are going through this journey and if you need any help, I'll be more than happy to help. Please feel free to reach out to me and we'll be happy to help. Thank you so much. And we'll now open it up for questions and answers. Thank you.